I am Lena Sullivan, the Adult Services Coordinator with Virginia Beach Public Library, and I'm very excited to introduce this event. This is the kickoff event for a grant-funded reading group series called Coming to America, Reading Groups for Public Libraries from the Yiddish Book Center. And I'd also like to thank the Virginia Beach Library Foundation for accepting this grant on our behalf. So our presenter tonight is Maggie Fraser Kirsh. She's a visiting assistant professor of Judaic Studies at the College of William and Mary, where she teaches classes on the Holocaust, gender and Judaism, religious autobiography, and European Jewish history. She's been awarded the Life Reborn Fellowship at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Fred and Ellen Fine Jewish Joint Distribution Committee Archives Fellowship. Presently, she's at work on her book manuscript, From Survivor to Citizen, Rehabilitating Young Holocaust Survivors in Great Britain and Israel.
All right, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much to the Virginia Beach Public Library for having me speak this evening. This is a vast topic, and so I thought for today we would really focus on the plight of refugees. In our world today, 1 out of every 113 people is displaced. They are asylum seekers, internally displaced, or refugees. Indeed, our world hasn't seen a refugee crisis on this scale since the end of World War II. Tonight, I would like to share with you the experiences of Jewish refugees to the United States. I'll begin with the immigrant experiences of those who arrived in the mid-19th century, but we will focus largely on the stories of those who fled persecution and hardship between 1880 and 1935. Who were these Jewish refugees? What worlds did they leave behind, and what awaited them in the United States? How did they make sense of their new lives in a new country? And what did being a refugee mean for them? This last question in particular, I will highlight 3 established Jewish writers who found themselves continually displaced in the 20th century. And those writers are Kadya Molodovsky, Sholem Aleichem, and Isaac Bashevis Singer. While these 3 authors had distinct experiences and they expressed those experiences in very specific ways, they also had a lot in common. They all wrote in Yiddish, which was the spoken language of many Jews in Europe. It was a language that's been spoken for about 1,000 years. This language stems from Middle High German. It's written with the Hebrew alphabet, and it has many Slavic and Hebrew influences. This evolving language was used for daily life, and it was starting to come into its own as a modern literary language by the late 19th century. Scholar David Roskies calls this language a quote-unquote portable homeland, a phrase that I really love. And Yiddish certainly played that role of a portable homeland for these 3 refugee authors. The second thing that they all had in common is that they were all born in shtetls in Eastern Europe. Shtetls were market towns that were populated largely by Jews, sometimes also by non-Jews, and they were situated in the Pale of Settlement. And this was a territory that extended from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and contained at one time up to 5 million Jews living in this region. Shtetl life was on the decline at the turn of the 20th century, and it would be completely wiped out during the Holocaust. Lastly, these 3 writers shared a common struggle, settling into a new world while being pulled emotionally and culturally to their old homeland. As Leah Goldberg, another Jewish writer, eloquently related, perhaps only migrating birds know, suspended between earth and sky, the heartache of 2 homelands. With you, I was transplanted twice. With you, pine trees, I grew roots in 2 disparate places. And so later in the talk, I'll be exploring, again, the ways that these authors dealt with their relationship to these 2 disparate places. But before we get there, I would like to provide some historical context for you. Historians estimate that in the year 1800, only about 10,000 Jews called the United States home. Now, this number would jump to 300,000 by 1870, thanks largely to the arrival of Jewish immigrants from Central Europe between 1830 and 1860. Now, these migrations were still relatively small, and they mostly consisted of single men searching for economic opportunities and perhaps also frustrated by the ways that anti-Jewish legislation had limited their lives back in Europe. When they got here, they settled mostly in Midwestern cities, where they continued, for the most part, the occupations that they had had in Europe, namely peddling. But some opened small stores, and a few even achieved great fame for their rags to riches trajectories. And two examples that you may be familiar with are Levi Strauss, who was a German Jewish immigrant, who, along with another immigrant friend, they manufactured these new kind of special pants with copper riveted pockets that became incredibly popular. And also we have the example of Marcus Goldman. When he came to the United States, he started off selling shoelaces and pots and pans, and he eventually worked his way up to becoming the founder of Goldman Sachs. Now, these are, of course, exceptional stories. For the most part, German Jews joined the middle class, and they would also eventually form the backbone of Jewish institutional life in the US that was really coming into its own by the late 1870s. By the end of the 19th century, immigration trends underwent an immense change that would leave an indelible mark on American Jewish communities. And indeed, not just American Jewish communities, but American culture and American life in general. So in the year 1880, there were 5 million Jews, roughly, living in Russian lands. Meanwhile, here in the United States, only about 3% of the world's Jewish population lived here. And all of that was going to shift dramatically beginning in 1881. Between 1881 and 1924, it's estimated that about 2.5 million Jews fled Eastern Europe. And what drove them to leave were two things. And in many instances, these two factors were very much related. And those were persecution on the one hand and bad economic conditions on the other. The majority of these Jews who left came here to the United States, which they called in Yiddish the Goldene Medina, the Golden Land. By 1915, over 3 million Jews would be living in the United States. So, going back to 1880, whereas only 3% of the world's Jewish population lived in the United States in 1880, by 1924, over 25% of the world's Jewish population would be living here. And I want to look now at why specifically they left during those years and what their experiences were like upon arriving in the United States. These are largely, again, Jews who were coming from Eastern Europe. And what brought them here was bad economic conditions, but also an increasingly anti-Semitic Europe. Now, while anti-Semitic discourse was on the rise all over Europe, particularly in politics, in Eastern Europe, the hatred of Jews was becoming increasingly physical in nature. And the best example of this that I can give you are the 1881 pogroms. Now, harsh decrees towards the Jews were not new in Eastern Europe. But before 1880, many of the Tsar's decrees were passed in the name of reform. And that all changed starting in 1881. That's the year that the state's official government policy began targeting Jews. And it wasn't just government policy and turbulent politics that made the lives of Jews increasingly difficult. Religious hatred of Jews was also on the rise, and that hatred was marked by sustained violence. This culminated in a series of violent attacks known by the Russian word pogrom, particularly between the years of 1881 and 1884. I'm going to pause here to give you a little bit of a backstory as to how these pogroms started and what happened once they began to unfold. In March of 1881, a member of a terrorist group, which was called the People's Will, assassinated the man who was the Tsar at the time, Tsar Alexander II. Now, among the many plotters in this assassination was a Jewish woman, and she came to be seen by Russians on the right as a symbol of a Jewish plot against Mother Russia. Consequently, attacks against Jews broke out in southern Russia starting in April of 1881. And as historians, we have a variety of documents from that year that contain very strongly the intensity of this violence. So I thought I would share two perspectives with you here. The first comes from a report. This was an official report of a local government investigation after the pogroms had passed through. And this report reads in part, "The city presented an extraordinary sight. Streets covered with feathers and obstructed with broken furniture, which had been thrown out of residences. Houses with broken doors and windows. A raging mob running about, yelling and whistling in all directions and continuing its work of destruction without let or hindrance. And as a finishing touch to this picture, complete indifference displayed by the local non-Jewish inhabitants to the havoc wrought before their eyes." And this is an excerpt from a letter written by a man named Michael Gordon. He sent it to his brother-in-law, Judah Leib Gordon. He wrote, and this letter, I think, very much captures the dread felt by Jews as they feared these impending pogroms. He wrote it in his letter, "The rumors heard from among the masses, the landlords, the peasants living in town, caused me endless fear all day and every day. My fright was not without cause, for all were poised to attack and to loot, to devour the wealth of the Jews and the labor of their hands. For 3 days and nights, we did not change our clothes, and we did not allow ourselves to sleep. On the 3rd of May, we saw peasants gathering together from all directions, each one carrying in his or her hand an empty sack, to be filled with loot and plunder. Knowing we were done for, we shook with fear and despair." Now, it's important to note that while the government itself did not orchestrate these pogroms, local authorities rarely intervened. And it's estimated that there were about 200 pogroms that broke out between 1881 and 1884 that left thousands of Jews wounded and homeless, and everyone terrified. Even the most assimilated Russian Jews who had written off perhaps previous anti-Semitic incidents as the result of ignorance rather than hatred, were shaken by this violence. And many began to consider that a future in Russia might no longer be possible for the Jews. Right-wing agitators identified Jews as conspirators against Russia, and Jews were thus subject to harsh legislation under the new Tsar, Alexander III. And part of that harsh legislation, the main form of it came in something called the May Laws that were passed in 1882. And there's a huge list of things that are included in the May Laws. For example, Jews were forced to move out of the villages that they called home, and they were relocated into urban areas. And in these new areas, there were very few prospects for employment, and they also were dealing with incredibly high rents. In these new regions, they were not allowed to buy or rent property. They were ineligible for civil service jobs. They were forbidden to trade on Sundays and Christian holidays. And additionally, quotas were established by the Russian Ministry of Education. And that alone, that last part of the legislation actually led to a huge exodus of Russian students to other countries in Europe so that they could continue their education in places where there weren't quotas in place. These policies, as I'm sure you can imagine, had massive economic repercussions. And evidence of this poverty is found in some multiple places and in some really interesting places. So I'll give you one example. Following the May Laws of 1882, in the city of Odessa, 66% of Jews were buried at their community's expense because the families could no longer afford to bury their own dead. Russian Jews, particularly following the May laws of 1882, began considering immigration. But not everybody had the resources for such an expensive move. And so many Russian Jews at this time began to organize politically, looking to things such as Zionism or socialism for answers and hope in a way to rebuild a more stable future for themselves. But the odds certainly seemed against them. In the year 1902, the Minister of the Interior in Russia blamed the current political unrest on the Jews. Now, again, while he, the Minister of the Interior, part of the Russian government, never ordered a single pogrom, he spoke very openly about hoping that those pogroms would serve as a warning for Russian Jews. He commented in 1902, quote, "We shall make your position untenable to such an extent that you will have to leave Russia to the very last man." Incitement against the Jews continued, and it culminated once more in the town of Kishinev, which is located in present-day Moldova. And this is a massacre that began on April 6, 1903. The Kishinev pogrom was initiated by rumors of ritual murder. The false accusation, also known as a blood libel, that Jews were preparing to sacrifice a Christian child. The pogrom broke out based on these rulers, and this violence lasted for 3 days. The violence was led by students from local colleges and seminaries. There were 5,000 soldiers stationed in the city. They did not emerge from their barracks during these 3 days of bloodshed. And over the course of these days, it's estimated that about 49 Jews were murdered, 587 were injured, thousands of businesses were destroyed, and at least 2,000 families were suddenly left homeless. There was great international protest to this violence, and some of this protest came from within Russia. One of the voices that was raised the loudest was a writer. His name is Chaim Bialik, and he spoke out against this violence. And as a writer, he was actually sent to the city of Kishinev to collect oral testimonies from the survivors there. And based on those oral testimonies, he wrote an epic poem. In Yiddish, it's called a Horban Lieder, which is an old Jewish literary response to catastrophe. In a poem, he sets out to commemorate this destruction. You also had quite a great deal of international coverage of the pogrom as well. You can see that there was a musical score written about the massacre here that was available for purchase in New York. We have a political cartoon on the right in which President Theodore Roosevelt is ordering Tsar Nicholas II to, quote unquote, stop your cruel oppression of the Jews. And it was this international coverage that really helped to inform Americans about the violent anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. 300 other cities and towns were struck by pogroms in 1905, including Kishinev. Meanwhile, reactionary forces blamed Jews for the political unrest, and some even went so far as to call for the extermination of Russian Jews. So if Russian Jews had the resources and the inclination, they started making plans to leave Russia and head westward. Of about 85% of the Eastern European Jews who left between 1881 and 1924, about 85% of them made it to the United States. They tended to be relatively young, and they tended to come as family units. And again, they were financially stable enough that they were able to afford the funds to both buy passage on these ships and also to be able to get a new life started once they arrived in America. Beginning in 1892, they arrived at and passed through Ellis Island, which you can see here in this picture. And most of them, as they were passing through, were classified as being of, quote unquote, a Hebrew race or nation. These refugees received assistance from a number of organizations. Two of the most prominent ones were the United Hebrew Charities. This was an older organization that had been around since 1874, and it was joined in its work by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was set up in 1881, initially by Russian Jews. And these and other charities like them provided everything from temporary housing and clothing to running soup kitchens to help these new refugees get on their feet once they arrived in the US. Now, unlike their German Jewish predecessors who arrived between 1830 and 1860, the vast majority of Eastern European Jewish refugees decided to remain in New York after their arrival. Many of them only had enough funds to get as far as New York City, but they also found on a practical level that New York boasted pretty much everything that they needed to start their new lives. There were a number of industries that required skilled workers, and these refugees arrived armed with these in-demand skills. And lastly, New York boasted everything they needed to settle into Jewish communal life: houses of worship, kosher butchers, ritual baths, etc. They also found that there was no need to immediately discontinue their use of Yiddish, particularly if they settled in New York. There were Yiddish newspapers, including the very popular Forward, which included an advice column for new immigrants. There were over a dozen Yiddish theaters located on the Lower East Side that staged both Jewish plays as well as some Yiddish translations of shows such as Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so this Yiddish literature both served to connect these recent refugees with the culture that they left behind, but also to introduce them to American history here in the US. These closely knit Jewish communities were densely populated. By 1910, it's estimated that about 75% of New York City's Jewish population lived on the Lower East Side. And this is an area that's about 1.5 square miles in size. It's important, though, not to romanticize their experiences during this time. This was not necessarily always one big happy community that was always supportive and always cooperative with one another. The Lower East Side, for example, had one of the highest divorce rates in the city, and desertion was a very serious problem among refugees. So much so that the Jewish Daily Forward ran in its newspaper a regular feature called the Gallery of Missing Men, in which they printed photos of men who had deserted their families, accompanied by the pleas of their wives and children to please contact them and to come home. And desertion was such a problem that by 1902, the United Hebrew Charities established a department just to deal with women who had been deserted by their husbands. Longer established Jewish communities, Jews whose families had arrived much earlier in the 1800s, they very willingly and anxiously helped these new immigrants out of a sense of familial duty. And a great example of that is an American Jewish woman named Lillian Wald. She was a nurse. She came from a very prosperous family that had been here in the United States for a while. And she was inspired to help recent Jewish immigrants after visiting a tenement. She recalled, quote, "I felt ashamed of being part of a society that permitted such conditions to exist." So in response, she established the Henry Street Settlement. And at the settlement, this was an institution that offered social facilities, nursing, educational support, and cultural programming for these recent immigrants. But some American Jews also supported these new immigrants for more self-serving purposes as well. They feared that unless these new arrivals quickly became Americans, that the immigrants would challenge the narrative of assimilation that American Jews had been working so hard to establish. There's a rich collection of literature that comes out of this time period, both memoirs and novels, and as well as poetry, that really captures the experiences of these immigrants. And two of the ones that I recommend in particular, I'll have a slide with the information a little bit later. But two of those are Mary Anton's The Promised Land, which is a memoir, and Anzia Jezierska's The Bread Givers, which is a novel. And a lot of the literature from this time, from recent immigrants, highlights the exciting new opportunities that they found here in the United States, particularly public secular education. And Mary Anton writes beautifully about what American public education meant to her as an immigrant. But they are also writing at the same time about incredibly difficult working conditions and sacrifices that these families are continually making. A number of these refugees and immigrants were working up to 19 hours a day, 7 days a week. Unions offered some protection from workers, but exploitation continued. And this exploitation was made glaringly obvious in 1911 during the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. There was a fire that broke out right around closing time in this factory, and most of the women workers in the factory were unable to escape because one of their doors was illegally locked during their workday. And that prevented people from escaping and from surviving the fire. And consequently, 146 women, mostly Jewish and Italian immigrants, lost their lives in that fire. For the Jewish community, this fire, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, really redoubled their commitment to things like trade unionism and progressive politics. This was a very highly politicized group. They had been active in politics in Europe. They drew on their experiences of political organization to demand a better life for them here in the United States. Class and cultural struggles were nothing new for them. These immigrants were simultaneously inserting themselves into American life while also drawing upon their past for solutions to their present. So one example of that is, of course, their political involvement. Another example of that is an institution called the Lonzhaftan in Yiddish. These were self-help organizations that were created by these immigrants. They were mutual aid societies, and they tended to be organized around the Eastern European cities of one's origin. So, for example, if Jews had come from Moava and they had settled in New York, they would network with other people who had come from Moava, and together they would form a Landsmannschaft, and they would help support one another. They provided their members with things like insurance, benefits, and loans. And in addition, these refugee communities established their own networks of Jewish charities. On the Lower East Side, they also established hundreds of synagogues and religious schools as well. Now, despite all of these communal structures, both religious and cultural, it's important to emphasize that these immigrants were not necessarily recreating the shtetls that they had left behind. And there were many reasons why the shtetl wasn't just recreated here in the United States. Some of those include the fact that there was no longer an all-encompassing religious life due to the fact that they were living in a place with a clear separation of church and state. Long work days for these immigrants also made it difficult, for example, to observe things like Shabbat and other Jewish holidays. And lastly, the attraction of American culture led to assimilation among these immigrants as well. So we see that in the span of about 30 years, America became home to one of the largest, most vibrant Jewish communities in the world, to the point that by 1917, you had about 1.5 million Jews who are contributing to this very rich, diverse center of Jewish life here in New York City. One of the Yiddish celebrity writers who settled in New York at this time was a man whose name was Solomon Rabinovich. He was born in 1859, and he was born in a town in present-day Ukraine called Pereyaslav. Shortly after his birth, his family moved to a smaller market town, a shtetl, called Voronko. And it was here that his father was a successful merchant and his family was relatively prominent, which was not a difficult thing to be in such a small town. In terms of an education, Solomon received a traditional Jewish education in the Cheder, a school for young Jewish boys where they would learn Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, and they would learn to read the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. But his family also hired a private tutor for him, and this tutor taught him Hebrew grammar and penmanship and helped him to qualify for a Russian high school that he went on to attend. Around the year 1883, Solomon began writing stories in Yiddish, and he adopted a pen name for himself, and that pen name is Sholem Aleichem. And his pen name in and of itself says a lot about this man and his character and how he thought about himself in relationship to Jewish literature. So Sholem Aleichem is a greeting. It works in both Yiddish and in Hebrew. And it literally means peace unto you, but it's also a way of saying, hi, how are you? And it's a greeting that can be used with a friend that you haven't seen in many years. It also works as a greeting for somebody that you know very well. And so if you can think about, kind of the equivalent in English would be, somebody whose pen name is, hi, how are you? But said with a lot of warmth behind it. Sholem Aleichem wrote Yiddish in a way that really captured the nuances of the language and of Yiddishkeit, of Yiddish culture. And one of the reasons why he became insanely popular is that readers heard themselves or their neighbors in his characters, in his stories. I think this quote from Irving Howe, a literary critic, sums it up beautifully. He explains, every Jew who could read Yiddish, whether he was Orthodox or secular, conservative or radical, loved Sholem Aleichem. For he heard in his stories the charm and melody of the common sprach. It's the Yiddish word for language that bound all of them together. Sholem Aleichem was such a prolific writer that by the time he set about to write his memoirs, which are a delightful read and I highly recommend them, his memoirs are called From the Fair. He writes in his memoir, From the Fair, he said, quote, I no longer belonged to the members of my household, but more to our literature and to that larger family known as the reading public. So he was a very prolific writer while he was still living in Eastern Europe. He ended up living through the pogroms of 1905. It's estimated there were about 300 of those pogroms that year. And he decided after that to settle in New York City. And I did a little sleuthing on Ancestry.com. And so you can see the ship manifest of his first arrival. That's the one that's posted on top of when he first arrived here in 1906. And he arrived here with some of his family. But this move ended up not being very permanent. He ended up spending the next 8 years touring Europe to make ends meet. He spent a great bit of his life in poverty, and he believed that he had such a strong following back in Europe that if he went on these literary tours, it would be much easier for him to support himself and his family. His poor health, though, really continued to decline, and he ended up being supported by donations from both friends and this wider reading public that he writes about. He settled once more in New York again in 1914, I think the date on the ship manifest is just kind of breathtaking when you think about the world events that were happening in the fall of 1914. Then he and his wife arrived once more in the United States to settle here. They moved into the Lower East Side, but this was not a happy ending for him either. His son Misha ended up being denied entry to the United States because of his tuberculosis. And so his son ended up staying in Switzerland with one of his daughters as well. And so the family was not able to live here in the United States together. The last novel that he wrote before his death is a book called Motul, the Cantor's Son. And in this book, the title character, Motul, is a boy from a town called Kastrolevka. Now, you will not be able to find Kastrolevka on any kind of map, and that's because it's a fictional town. Much like Sholem Aleichem gave himself a pen name, he also created this whole world, this whole town, this geography of this town, Kastrolevka. And he based Kastrolevka on his real-life hometown of Voronka. And you can find many quotes about Kastrolevka in many of his different stories. And these quotes, I'm not going to read all of them here for you. I just kind of wanted to give an example of the fact that he takes this town of Kastrolevka and he uses it as the setting in so many different stories. And in every place, it's depicted as being very magical and small and pretty and just a place that you would really want to go and spend some time. It's this homage that he pays to an idyllic life, a way of life that was already coming undone by the time that he left Europe. This was a place that probably wasn't quite as idyllic and perfect as he depicted. It's painted with a very heavy coat of nostalgia. So in the story, Motul the Cantor's Son, and here are some other quotes. I'll read the last one because I do think this is quite a fun quote. He's talking just about how wonderful Kastrolevka is in one of his short stories called The Town of Little People. And he says, when the Holy Sabbath arrives, let Yehutzpah perish, let Odessa be razed, let Paris itself sink into the earth. Kastrolevka lives. And it is a fact that since Kastrolevka was founded, no Jew has gone hungry there on the Sabbath. So a very idyllic, a very beautiful place indeed, that's sheltered from all of the ills of the rest of the world. So in his last novel, Motul the Cantor's Son, it chronicles Motul's travels to America. It takes him a long time to get there. He has stops in Antwerp and in London, and he finally arrives here in the United States. And later in the story, so Motul is, of course, in this book, his hometown is listed as Kastrolevka. And later in the story, it's revealed, once Motul has arrived in the United States, that a pogrom has broken out in his hometown of Kastrolevka after his departure. And you can't say that any of these stories are straight up autobiographical, but you can really see strands of Sholem Aleichem's life that are very clearly on display for the reader. And I think this is one of those examples of that. Sholem Aleichem has been called the Jewish Mark Twain. Like Mark Twain, his stories, such as Motul the Cantor's Son, are filled with humor. But this humor is situated alongside some very dark history and some very dark events as well. When Sholem Aleichem died in 1916 in New York, it was the largest funeral that the city had ever seen up until that time. At least 100,000 people lined the streets to pay their respect to this great Yiddish writer. Sholem Aleichem may have died in poverty, but his life in America toward the end of his days meant that he was sheltered from the Great War. And so what I would like to do now is to take us back to Eastern Europe during the Great War and to highlight the conditions that Jews experienced during World War I and how those shaped the last two Yiddish writers that I will discuss. When we think about the war on the Eastern Front, we're talking about a war that's being fought between Russia and the German and Austro-Hungarian empires. And between 1914 and 1918, you constantly had attacks and counterattacks. And because of those, you also had constantly shifting front lines. And the ways in the places in which those front lines of the war were shifting, they all cut through an area that about 4 million Jews called home. So while all civilian populations suffered greatly on the Eastern Front, the positioning of Jewish communities near the bulk of the fighting resulted in acute devastation and considerable dislocation as well. So for example, as early as 1915, more than 80,000 Russian Jewish war refugees had fled to Warsaw, where they had hoped that they would be safer. Not all Jewish war refugees were quote unquote voluntary. And I hesitate to use the word that anybody is a voluntary refugee in war. But unlike those 80,000 Russian Jewish war refugees who decided to leave their homes to seek sanctuary in Warsaw, you also had instances where Jewish communities were forcibly uprooted by the Russian armed forces and who were deported out of the regions where they were living and away from those front lines. So for example, at least 50,000 Jews from Galicia and Bukovina were deported by the Russian armed forces during the Russian occupation of those places. As I said, this devastation, both physically and economically and socially, was acutely felt by Jews in Eastern Europe. For example, in the city of Vilna, between 1914 and 1917, the death rate among Jews more than tripled. And many Jews were very much dependent upon social welfare organizations to provide them with their basic needs. Unfortunately, things didn't much improve after the war was over. When the Central Powers collapsed in November of 1918, it resulted in virtual anarchy, where a lot of these front lines had been located, and Jews found themselves the target of a number of attacks. For example, in the city of Lvov, over a 2-day period in November, at least 73 Jews were murdered. So the post-war years did not offer much relief, at least not the immediate post-war years. There were severe food shortages at the end of the war. And in Ukraine, for example, Jews were blamed. They were the subject of a lot of conspiracy theories. And this, again, led to renewed and sustained waves of physical violence. It's estimated that in a 1-year time span in Ukraine, tens of thousands of Jews were murdered in these series of pogroms. Hundreds of children became orphans. Jews in interwar Europe were living at a time of great contradictions. It was a time of increasing threats, increasing violence, economic ruin, and the rise of extreme nationalism. The adherents of this extreme nationalism did not see Jews as citizens of their respective countries, but saw them continually as outsiders. At the same time, there was a push for the advancement of minority rights in the post-war period. And on paper, at least, it sounded like a promising situation. So for example, the minority treaties, which came out of the Paris Peace Conference, guaranteed, quote, total and complete protection of life and freedom of all people, regardless of their birth, nationality, language, race, or religion. We also see there was an incredible flourishing of Jewish culture, particularly among Jews who were younger, and particularly in Germany, Poland, the Soviet Union. For example, according to the Constitution of the Polish Republic, ethnic minorities had the right to establish their own schools, their own cultural institutions, and printing presses in their own language. And they very much did this. And we see evidence of the great popularity of the Yiddish language in the interwar period. In 1931, 80% of Jews in Poland claimed that Yiddish was their mother tongue, the very first language that they learned as children. In major cities like Vilna, seen here, you could buy up to a dozen different Yiddish newspapers at your local newspaper stand. Yiddish theater was very popular. Here's one of Sholem Aleichem's plays being staged in Warsaw. Yiddish stand-up comedy arrived on the scene during this time as well. On a more serious note, you had literary groups, such as this one, that called itself the Gang. The Gang was a cultural avant-garde movement that was particularly active beginning in 1919, and their period of productivity lasted about 5 years. And the members of the Gang were secular Jews, and they thought of themselves as modern, but they were also determined at the same time to create a new lay culture in Yiddish. And so they hosted exhibitions and poetry recitals and journal articles. But the cultural output of this one group alone in the span of 5 years is incredible. This was a generation that valued scholarship and learning. We see the establishment of the Jewish Scientific Institute, known today most commonly as YIVO. It was established in 1925 in Vilna. The city of Vilna had the nickname at this point in history as being the Jerusalem of Lithuania because of the richness of Jewish life that was being lived in Vilna. YIVO became an incredible repository of knowledge thanks to the work of Jewish scholars of history and language and culture and even psychology. Public reading rooms and libraries first appeared in Poland in the 19th century. By the interwar period, though, their popularity had really taken off. And there's even some historians that are doing work with the reading habits of the patrons of these libraries and what that can tell us about the individuals that used these sources. Private schools were thriving. There was a Jewish school for every shade of ideology and every religious movement you could imagine. At the same time, most Jewish children attended Polish state schools because their parents believed that that was the ticket to economic and social advancement in Poland. Jewish youth movements were also on the rise. And like those private schools that I just mentioned, there was one for every shade of ideology. There were ones for Zionists and ones for Bundists and ones for ultra-Orthodox Jewish youths as well. And these youth movements offered activities, they offered opportunities to learn new skills, they offered leadership opportunities, but they also offered community building, which was really important to a number of young people as well. And so this excerpt comes from a memoir that was written by a woman. All we know is that the pseudonym that she gave herself was GS. And she talks about how going to her Batar meetings, even though if she was tired at the end of a workday, she would go, and it was always noisy and cheerful. And when she left, she always felt refreshed because of that community. It's important to remember that this was a generation of people who believed that they were living in a post-war period. They did not know, of course, that they were living in an interwar period. And so for the most part, personal essays and diaries, they're not focusing on the rise of anti-Semitism at all. They're focused on their daily lives. But beginning in 1935, a darker period began to emerge. There was a bad economic period in Poland that lasted from 1936 to 1938. There was increasing anti-Semitic legislation that was being passed in neighboring Germany. And there was also increasing discrimination. So there were quotas, for example, in Polish and Lithuanian schools that limited the number of Jewish students who could be admitted to these public high schools and universities. Even if a Jewish student was lucky enough to make it into the quota and to be at one of these schools or universities, increasingly they were forced to sit on what were called ghetto benches in the back of the classroom. They weren't allowed to sit with their non-Jewish classmates. And this led to a variety of responses. Self-defense organizations became popular. People were concerned that they needed to protect themselves physically from future pogroms. Politics was another way that Jews were organizing to, again, speak up about their concerns and about the instability that they were increasingly feeling. Another response, of course, is also immigration. But unfortunately, immigration was incredibly difficult in 1935, thanks to immigration restrictions here in the United States. Nevertheless, some refugees did manage to flee from Poland in 1935, including two other prominent Yiddish writers, and I'll close tonight by introducing those to you briefly. The first is Kadia Molodowski, who was born in 1894. As a child, her father taught Hebrew to young boys in a cheder, in a religious institution. Her mother ran a shop, opened a factory. Her grandmother, who did a lot of the caretaking in the home, was the one who taught Molodowski how to read Yiddish. She grew up in a shtetl called Bariza Kartuska, which was located in a Tsarist Russian province, which today is now part of Belarus. She herself received a pretty rare education for a girl at the time. She studied Hebrew. Her parents hired her Russian tutors to teach her the Russian language. She loved geography and philosophy. She was a student of world history. And because of this background, it's not too surprising that she went on to become a teacher. In the year 1920, she was living in Kiev, where she survived a horrific pogrom that tore through the city. And one of her jobs following the pogrom is that she worked as an educator and a caretaker in a children's home that was sponsored by the Joint Distribution Committee, where children who had survived these pogroms, and if they had been orphaned, they could go to live in these places. And so the one that she worked in was in a city called Brest-Litovsk. She also spent time living in Odessa and in Warsaw for some brief periods. By the time that she moved to the United States in 1935, she was already a well-established author. And when she got here, she continued writing and publishing poetry. She also had a weekly column for the Forward entitled Great Jewish Women. Beginning in May 1941, she wrote a novel that was entitled From Lublin to New York, The Diary of a Jewish Refugee Girl. And like many Yiddish novels of the day, it didn't begin as a novel, but rather it was published in weekly installments in a Yiddish language newspaper. And this novel, through its main character, Rivka, drew attention to the struggles of refugees during this tumultuous time. And the novel also reflects on how Americans themselves were responding to those refugees. And so some of the topics that Molodowski covers in her novel include communication and language barriers, learning new social norms in a new country, the frustration as a refugee of knowing about the horrors that are still happening back in your hometown and being unable to help from afar, all the while trying to assimilate into a new world. And one of the things that Molodowski highlights through this novel is that it wasn't just American culture that the main character had to acclimate to. It was American Jewish culture. Just because she was living with Jewish relatives didn't necessarily mean that they could relate to her and understand what she was going through. She writes in her novel about the protagonist Rivka feeling a very clear disconnect, even with Jewish women who had been refugees themselves only decades before. And here's a quote from the novel. This evening, some neighbors came over to hear about the old country. Every one of them talked about her home, asking very little. It seems that they were interested in me only so that they could have an audience for their own stories about the old country. The women talked a lot about themselves and didn't give me the slightest opportunity to tell them how I became a refugee. Molodowski herself was haunted by her family that she left behind in Poland during World War II. She began writing a poem, an example of Horban leader, entitled "Only King David Remained." In writing this epic poem, much like Bialik's The City of Slaughter, she's participating in this Jewish tradition of literary response to catastrophe, mourning the victims, and also mourning the loss of those vibrant worlds as well. In many ways, Molodowski continued to be unsettled. She ended up moving to Israel after World War II. She didn't really feel at home there either. She moved back to the United States. And it was here in the United States where she passed away in 1975. And lastly, I want to introduce you to Isaac Bashevis Singer. He was born in Lonzhaftan, which is a town outside of Warsaw, in 1902. His family moved to another town just a few years later. And then after that, by 1908, they settled in the city of Warsaw. And in Warsaw, his father held a rabbinical court. And Isaac Bashevis Singer would go on to memorialize his father's rabbinic teachings and the religious and ethical debates that happened in their family courtyard. He wrote about them in a number of his memoirs, including In My Father's Court and A Day of Pleasure. And again, he writes very lovingly about his childhood in these places. In 1970, his family moved to Buia Gore, which was his mother's hometown. And they moved here specifically because they were worried about the German army invading Warsaw. And he really enjoyed his time in this much smaller village. And he commented later that in this world of old Jewishness here in the city of Buia Gore, I found a spiritual treasure trove. I lived Jewish history. And this was another place, much like his courtyard in Warsaw. He would draw upon these physical landscapes later after arriving in the United States when writing his stories. He moved back to Warsaw in 1921. He tried rabbinical school. It wasn't for him. He moved back to Buia Gore, where he worked as a Hebrew tutor, moved back to Warsaw, lived with a brother. And then finally, in 1935, he moved to New York to join one of his brothers who was already living here, Israel Joshua. And one of the reasons that he gave later for making the move in 1935 is he was increasingly worried about Nazi Germany. He had already lived through one German invasion of his country, and he didn't want to live through another one. When he arrived here in the United States, he worked for the Forward. And like Molodowski, his writing really intensified during World War II. He knew many languages, much like Molodowski, but he continued to express himself primarily in Yiddish when it came to his writings. And he did so even though in at least one instance, he expressed doubt as to whether Yiddish could adequately depict Jewish life in America. He wrote, "Life here is so rich and varied that probably no one could name in Yiddish everything that his eyes perceive or his heart conceives. The better Yiddish prose writers avoid writing about American Jewish life. Through his language, the Yiddish writer is bound by the past. Any attempt to push our language into the future is in vain." While Singer, like Molodowski, arrived safely to the US before the Holocaust, his later works are filled with characters who are Holocaust survivors. Between 1946 and 1954, about 140,000 Jewish displaced persons arrived to the United States. They brought with them the trauma of their past, the trauma of the war years. And this trauma is evident in a number of Singer's novels, including Enemies, a Love Story, which was first published in the foreword in 1966. And the characters in this book include some that are observing the frivolities, for example, of Coney Island, all the while plotting escape routes, worried that a new Holocaust might come to American shores. And so here's an excerpt from Enemies, a Love Story, where this happens. He writes, as Herman walked along, his eyes sought hiding places in case the Nazis were to come to New York. Could a bunker be dug somewhere nearby? Could he hide himself in the steeple of a Catholic church? He had never been a partisan, but now he often thought of positions from which it would be possible to shoot. Much like Molodowski's book, The Refugees and Enemies, a Love Story, feel disconnected from American Jews who had arrived to the US and settled here under different historical circumstances. In 1974, when Singer received the National Book Award, he said, quote, I am happy to call myself a Jewish writer, a Yiddish writer, an American writer. We see in the self-description, Singer pays homage to his people, the Jews, to his mother tongue, Yiddish, and to his adopted country, America. So in conclusion, the stories of Singer, Molodowski, and Sholem Aleichem span continents, yes. But not only that, they provide portraits of lost worlds. These portraits were written under unusual, tense circumstances in very liminal times and places. Mary Anton, a Jew who was born in the Pale of Settlement in 1881, the year that the terrible pogroms began, moved to the United States at the age of 13. In her own memoir, The Promised Land, she explains, it is painful to be consciously of two worlds. The wandering Jew in me seeks forgetfulness. I'm not afraid to live on and on, if only I don't have to remember too much. A long past vividly remembers, like a heavy garment that clings to your limbs when you would run. She remarks in her memoir that one of the reasons she wrote her memoir was to tuck away her past, to discard it, to be done with it. Of course, the irony is that in writing her memoir, to put it aside, Anton and others like her have preserved a bit of the past, and they have made it accessible to readers like you and me. Sholem Aleichem, Isaac Bashevis Singer, and Kadya Molodowski use that portable homeland of theirs, the Yiddish language, to reflect on the complexities of being a refugee in the 20th century. I hope that you will be inspired to enter these literary worlds for yourself. While they write of landscapes and of people who have long since vanished, you will find that the themes of human dignity, trauma, resilience, loneliness, and adaptability resonate in our own world in our 21st century today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will, let's see. Make it so you can see those questions. Let's see.
All communities across the U.S. under the sponsorship of already established German Jews in those communities, such as Norfolk, Richmond, Lynchburg, Virginia. Yes, so I don't know, but the particulars of those cities, and I'm not sure which time period Jane was asking for, was asking about. there were a number, there were some strong Jewish communities here in Virginia, of Jews that had arrived in that 1830 to 1860 time period, and who were relatively established. And a number of them, again, continue to help out with refugees as they came here. The best example is the Tallhammer family, who's most famous for their department store in Richmond, Virginia. And they actually sponsored a number of young German Jewish refugees to come settle here in Virginia, and they paid for their sponsorship. That was a very small number, though. It was incredibly difficult to leave Europe. Molodowski and Isaac Bashevis were incredibly fortunate that they came in 1935, but that was really the exception rather than the norm.
Do we have any other questions?
Oh, and I see there was a follow-up from Jane. She was asking specifically about like 1880 to 1924. And I'm afraid I don't really know too much about our local history during that time period. It'd be something that would be really fascinating to research.
Let's see, it looks like we have something in the chat that didn't show up in Q&A that says Jews in the Civil War.
Jews in the Civil War. So I was actually on an honors thesis that a student defended just a few weeks ago here at the College of William and Mary. There has been very little done on Jews in the Civil War. There are a couple of great books that have recently come out. But because of the numbers, again, because there were really so few Jews living here in the United States before the 1880s, that 1880 to 1924 history tends to really overshadow a lot of the other history that happens. I'm not an expert on Jews in the Civil War, but it is a really rich topic. And one of the themes that comes up in a lot of the recent literature, the recent scholarship, is that Jews who were fighting during the American Civil War were, whether it be fighting for the North or for the South, is that they saw it as a way of proving their American identity and of being part of that American project and proof of their assimilation here in the United States.
I think that's all of the questions. I did want to speak somewhat to Jane's question. There was a documentary that we showed at the library about specifically Jewish immigration in the Tidewater area. And I will go find the link to that. I'm not sure it's something that can be watched online, but you can at least get a DVD. And you can get it from the library as soon as we are open again. But I'll send an email out to all participants with that information included in case anyone wants to watch it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sandy Hopkins. I'm an adult services librarian at the Central Library. Thank you for coming. I want to thank Maggie for a wonderful presentation there, and let you know that as the part of the Coming to America reading groups for public libraries, we will be having 4 book discussion groups. These are the 4 books, and Motul, the Cantor's Son, will be the first one. That will be on July 16th from 6 to 7 p.m. Right after this program, you can actually go on our library website calendar and register for that book group. As part of the grant, we received 15 copies of each book, and those will be given to the first 15 participants that register. We haven't set the dates for the other ones yet. Like Lena said, we're kind of in transition with the opening of the library, and hopefully in the future can do those in person. But the first one is going to be on the same platform, which is WebEx. So we will discuss the 3 books of Yiddish literature in translation, which Maggie talked about, Motul, the Cantor's Son, Enemies by Isaac Bashevis, and A Jewish Refugee in New York. Now, for the fourth book, we were asked to pick another immigrant community served by the Virginia Beach Public Libraries, and we selected the Filipino community. And so that book is Patron, Saints of Nothing. And it is a young adult novel. It's about a young man that's in college that learns that his cousin that's in the Philippines, where he was born, was not Americanized and was living in poverty, actually was killed. So he goes back by himself to the Philippines where he grew up to kind of investigate the death of his cousin. So there is a lot of Filipino culture, language, and food elements in that book. So these are the four. The first one you can register for tonight. And I hope you were inspired to read the first one and join us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this program. We really appreciate you joining us online. I'll go ahead and send an email out to all the registrants with the link to register for the reading groups, just in case you're not able to find that in our calendar. So thank you so much to Maggie Kirsh for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
All right, have a good night.